Welcome to Unexplained Encounters, the channel where we bring you terrifying true stories and spine-chilling encounters with the unknown. Tonight, we dive into another mysterious tale that will leave you questioning reality. But be warned, not every encounter can be easily explained. As you watch, remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that will keep you up at night. The image of the black cat has held an important place in the folklore and superstitions of many cultures. Its presence is often linked to mysticism, omens, and forces beyond human comprehension. From one culture to another, the black cat's significance varies greatly. Sometimes it is a harbinger of good fortune, while in other instances, it symbolizes misfortune and death. In medieval Europe, black cats were often seen as symbols of evil, particularly in the dark of night. It was believed that if one encountered a black cat after sundown, misfortune was inevitable. Some believed that witches could transform into black cats, moving stealthily through the shadows of towns, evading those hunting them. In a time when witchcraft and religious fears were widespread, anything associated with black cats was viewed with suspicion. One enduring legend claims that if a black cat crosses someone's path, disaster is sure to follow. It was even said that the eyes of black cats were gateways to hell, and those who gazed into them would be haunted by malevolent spirits. In contrast, ancient Egypt held black cats in the highest esteem. Egyptians revered cats, especially black ones. The goddess Batet, depicted with the head of a cat, symbolized home, love, and protection. Black cats were seen as her earthly manifestations, and harming a cat was considered a grave offense against the gods. According to ancient records, Egyptians kept statues of Batet in their homes, believing that cats could ensure the safety and prosperity of their families. If a cat died mysteriously or disappeared, it was interpreted as a divine warning that a family might soon face hardship or tragedy. In the United Kingdom, black cats have a more complex image. In certain regions, they are seen as bringers of good luck. On wedding days, spotting a black cat was believed to guarantee a happy marriage and a prosperous life. In coastal towns, sailors believed that black cats protected their ships and ensured safe voyages. One legend tells of a black cat that saved a ship during a violent storm, securing its place as a symbol of safety in some coastal villages. Yet, in other parts of the UK, black cats were also seen as omens of death, particularly if they were found wandering near doorsteps at night. In Japan, black cats are surrounded by mystique. Some folklore suggests that black cats have the ability to see into the realm of the dead, perceiving things invisible to human eyes. While some regions of Japan regard black cats as good fortune, many legends link them to the supernatural. It is believed that a black cat could lead restless spirits back into the human world, often to seek revenge or complete unfinished business. If a black cat lingered outside your home at night, it might signal that a vengeful ghost was near. In America, the black cat has become synonymous with death and the supernatural. During Halloween, black cats are often depicted as companions of ghosts and witches, believed to serve as messengers to otherworldly forces. Many believe that seeing a black cat on Halloween night is an omen of bad luck. In American culture, black cats have come to represent death, the undead, and the mysteries of the supernatural. Even in India, black cats are seen as symbols of ill fortune. It is said that if a black cat crosses your path, you should stop in your tracks and reconsider your plans, lest disaster follow. Folklore links black cats to death and disaster, their presence viewed as an inescapable sign of bad things to come, particularly if one encounters them while traveling at night. These legends and superstitions have imbued the black cat with both dread and fascination. Their eyes are said to peer through time and space into realms we cannot see. And when they appear, it is often at moments when a family or individual is about to face a monumental change, or worse, an impending tragedy. Chapter 1: Life in the Village. Our story begins in a peaceful village, nestled in a remote valley surrounded by dense forests. The village, far removed from the bustle of cities, was a place where everyone knew one another, and people relied on their neighbors. Every evening, the church bells rang from the village's only tower, signaling the end of the day and reminding villagers to return home. Most families in the village operated small farms or worked in nearby mines. John's family, however, stood out. Their home was situated on the western edge of town, near a patch of desolate shrubland where the wind often whispered eerie sounds. After John's father passed away, the small house fell into disrepair. The garden lay abandoned, overgrown with moss and weeds, and time itself seemed to slow to a standstill around it. John's father had died 2 years earlier in a mining accident, an event that shattered their family. His father had been the family's provider, and his death left them in financial ruin and caused John's mother to become unusually sensitive and anxious. She no longer carried the optimism she once had. Instead, she grew irritable, prone to fits of anger directed at John, though he understood that it stemmed from grief and frustration. Each morning, when John awoke, he would find his mother sitting by the kitchen window, staring blankly at their overgrown garden. She held a cup of warm water in her hands but never drank it. She would sit there for hours, her gaze fixed on a corner of the yard, as though waiting for something to arrive. At school, John was quiet, and the other children avoided him. Ever since his father's death, he had kept to himself. Although he performed well academically, the other children found his family strange, especially his mother. Rumors swirled that after John's father died, his mother became unhinged, often muttering to herself. This odd behavior made the other children steer clear of him, sometimes even crossing the street to avoid walking past his house. Time passed quietly in this stifling atmosphere. John became accustomed to the silence that seemed to cloak their home. Some villagers whispered that John's family was cursed, but he paid no mind to the gossip. For him, it was simply the reality of losing his father and watching their life unravel in the aftermath. But John's mother didn't see things that way. She was convinced that ever since her husband's death, a dark force had taken hold of their home. She became increasingly superstitious, visiting the village's church frequently to pray for protection and hanging strange talismans around the house to ward off evil spirits. She believed that only through supernatural means could she lift the curse that had descended upon them. Chapter 2: The Arrival of the Black Cat. It was a dreary afternoon, the sky growing gray in anticipation of rain. John was walking home from school, his shoes caked with mud from the wet, unpaved roads. His thoughts drifted to a math problem he hadn't yet solved, hoping it would distract him from the ever-present weight of sorrow in his life. As he neared his house, he looked up and froze. Sitting on the steps to his front door was a figure cloaked in darkness. It was a black cat. Its fur was pitch black, and in the dim light, it shimmered faintly, but what stood out most were its eyes, deep, staring intently at John, as if it had been waiting for him. John hesitated. He didn't recall ever seeing a cat like this around town. Most of the village cats were tabby, gray, or white. A solid black cat was an unusual sight, especially in their remote town. "Where did you come from?" John muttered under his breath. The black cat didn't respond. Of course it didn't. It just continued staring, its eyes never leaving him, almost as though it was expecting something. A chill ran down John's spine. Unease settled in his gut. He approached the cat, trying to scare it off. "Shoo! Get out of here!" He waved his hands. The cat didn't budge. It sat there, calm and composed, its eerie gaze never faltering. There was no fear, no typical feline skittishness. Instead, there was a quiet intensity, a silence that unnerved him. John frowned. This cat was unsettling. He waved his hand again, this time louder. "Go away!" Still, the black cat didn't move. It didn't even meow. "What's wrong with you?" John muttered, more to himself than to the cat. Just then, he heard his mother's voice from inside the house. "John? Who's out there? What's going on?" John turned to see his mother standing in the doorway, her face etched with concern. Her gaze quickly landed on the black cat, and her expression changed in an instant. She froze. Fear flickered across her face. "That black cat, where did it come from?" Her voice trembled, as if recalling something terrible. "I don't know. It just showed up at the door. I tried to shoo it away, but it won't leave," John replied, puzzled. He had never seen his mother react so strongly to an animal before. Her face grew pale, and she narrowed her eyes at the cat, as though it were some sort of omen. She gripped the doorframe, her hands shaking slightly. "Black cats, they're not a good sign," she whispered. "Especially one that shows up at your doorstep." John frowned. "That's just superstition, Mom. It's probably just a stray." But his mother shook her head, the fear still clouding her eyes. Without another word, she turned and disappeared back into the house. Yet, John could sense her hurried, anxious steps, as if she were fleeing from something she didn't want to face. John stood alone in the doorway, watching the cat that remained unmoving. The air around him seemed to thicken with tension. He felt a growing unease. Finally, he decided to retreat inside, shutting the door firmly behind him. But when he peered out the window, the cat was still there, sitting on the steps, watching, waiting. Chapter 3: Killing the Black Cat. Days went by, and the black cat remained. No matter the weather, whether it was rain or sun, it sat at the front door, still as a statue, seemingly unmoved by any attempts to drive it away. The townsfolk began to notice, some even stopping briefly as they passed by, casting curious glances at the peculiar scene. Yet, they would quickly walk on, whispering rumors to one another as they hurried away. In time, the whispers grew louder. The town's gossip turned to speculation that John's family was cursed. Those who had once visited his mother ceased to do so. Now, even the few friends they had in town were keeping their distance, afraid that misfortune might spread to them. John's mother was slipping into an abyss of anxiety. Her nights were filled with fitful sleep, often interrupted by nightmares. In her dreams, the black cat stood at the foot of her bed, its piercing eyes staring through her, its fur matted with blood. It said nothing but radiated a palpable malevolence that left her shaking when she awoke. The vividness of these dreams was so real that, even in the daylight, she could still feel the cat's eyes on her. One morning, after another sleepless night, her patience snapped. Her face was ashen, and the shadows beneath her eyes told of exhaustion and something much darker: desperation. "John," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper, "we can't let this continue." John looked up from his schoolwork, sensing something was wrong. He had noticed his mother's increasing agitation, but this was different. There was an intensity in her voice that alarmed him. "What do you mean, Mom?" She walked over to the window and glanced outside. The black cat was still there, sitting on the front step, watching them. She bit her lip and took a deep breath, her eyes full of dread. "That cat, it won't leave. And as long as it stays, the bad luck stays with us." John furrowed his brow, perplexed. "Mom, that's just a superstition. It's just a cat, nothing more." "You don't understand," she said, shaking her head, her voice trembling. "You don't know what black cats mean. They bring death, John. Ever since it showed up, things have only gotten worse. I see it in my dreams every night, staring at me, waiting." John felt a chill crawl up his spine but tried to stay rational. "It's all in your head, Mom. There's no reason to be afraid of it." But his mother was past the point of rationality. Her grip on reality was slipping, consumed by fear and superstition. She walked to the kitchen and pulled out a large wooden club, her knuckles white as she clenched it. "If it won't leave on its own, we have to make it leave," she said with a cold finality in her voice. John's eyes widened in alarm. "What are you going to do?" Her hands were trembling, but her face showed a grim determination. "If it won't go, we have to force it. It's cursed, John. We'll never be free of it until it's gone." John wanted to stop her, but the look in her eyes froze him in place. He could see the madness in her expression, a desperation that had long since overtaken reason. He watched helplessly as she pushed open the door and stepped outside, the wooden club clutched in her hands. The black cat didn't run. It simply watched her approach, calm, unafraid. Its eyes, those unnerving, glowing eyes, locked onto hers, as if it had been expecting this moment all along. His mother's breath came in ragged gasps as she stood over the cat, her body trembling with fear and fury. She raised the club high above her head. "Leave us alone!" she screamed, her voice breaking with emotion. But the cat didn't move. It stared at her with a chilling, almost knowing gaze, its stillness unnerving. In that moment, it didn't seem like an animal at all, but something more, something ancient and beyond understanding. With a scream, his mother brought the club down, striking the cat hard. The sound of the impact was sickening, a sharp thud that echoed in the silent morning. The cat let out a blood-curdling yowl, the kind of scream that seemed to pierce the very air around them. It writhed on the ground, blood spilling onto the dirt. But even as it lay there, broken and bleeding, its eyes never left her. John stood frozen in the doorway, his breath caught in his throat. He could barely believe what he was witnessing. Again and again, she struck the cat until it stopped moving, its lifeless body lying in a pool of blood. His mother stood over it, panting heavily, her face pale and drained of color. The club fell from her hands as she stared down at the mess, her eyes wide and blank. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, without a word, she knelt beside the bloody corpse and, with shaking hands, lifted it into her arms. "We have to get rid of it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Take it to the woods. Bury it deep. We can't let it stay here." John, still in shock, could only nod. He took the dead cat from her, its body limp and heavy in his hands. The weight of it felt far greater than it should, like he was holding something far more sinister than the remains of a simple cat. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, he carried the cat's body deep into the forest, far from the house, and buried it beneath a large tree. But as he covered the grave with dirt, an unease settled over him, a feeling that the cat's death had not lifted the curse. In fact, he feared they had made things much, much worse. Chapter 4. The Start of the Supernatural Phenomena. For a few days after the black cat's death, life in the house seemed to return to normal, or as close to normal as it could get. John noticed his mother's anxiety had slightly lessened, and the oppressive atmosphere that had weighed so heavily on the home seemed to lift, even if just a little. But this tranquility didn't last long. One night, John was jolted awake by an overwhelming sense of dread. His heart was pounding, his sheets damp with sweat. At first, he couldn't remember what had scared him, but then the fragments of a dream came rushing back. In the dream, John had been standing in the woods, where he had buried the black cat. The forest was eerily silent, with no wind, no sound of animals, just an oppressive stillness. As he looked around, he suddenly heard a soft, low meow. It was faint but unmistakable. He spun around, but saw nothing. The sound came again, this time closer. John's pulse quickened. The darkness between the trees seemed to thicken, as if something was lurking there, watching him. Then, from the shadows, the cat emerged. Not alive, but twisted and grotesque, its body bloodied and broken, just as it had been when his mother had beaten it to death. Its glowing eyes locked onto him, filled with fury and hate. John sat up in bed, gasping for air. The vividness of the dream had left him rattled, as if the cat had somehow found its way back into his mind. He shook his head, telling himself it was just a nightmare, a manifestation of the guilt and fear he'd been carrying since the day they killed the cat. But it didn't end there. The following night, John was once again awoken by a strange sound, a faint scratching, like claws scraping against wood. It was coming from the window. His breath caught in his throat as he sat up, staring at the darkened window. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment he was too scared to move. Slowly, he forced himself out of bed, tiptoeing towards the window. When he reached it, he hesitated, then pulled the curtain back just a little. Nothing. The yard outside was empty, bathed in moonlight. John let out a shaky breath, trying to calm his racing heart. It had to have been his imagination, but as he turned away from the window, he heard it again, the scratching, this time from behind him. He whipped around, and for a split second, he could have sworn he saw the silhouette of a cat slinking away into the shadows. He spent the rest of the night wide awake, his heart thudding in his chest, ears straining for any other sounds. The strange occurrences didn't stop there. Chapter 5: The Supernatural Intensifies. John wasn't the only one haunted by the memory of the black cat. His mother had been experiencing her own horrors. One night, John heard her screaming from her bedroom. He rushed in, only to find her sitting upright in bed, drenched in sweat and clutching the sheets with white-knuckled hands. Her eyes were wild with fear. "I saw it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was here. The cat. It was in my room." John's stomach twisted into knots. He wanted to tell her it was just a dream, but how could he, when he had been seeing it too? His mother's mental state began to deteriorate rapidly. The once small signs of anxiety and paranoia turned into full-blown obsession. She began pacing the house, muttering under her breath, constantly checking the windows and doors as if expecting the cat to reappear. Sometimes, she would sit in the kitchen for hours, staring blankly into space, mumbling about curses and bad luck. She placed talismans around the house, hoping they would ward off whatever force had been unleashed. But the supernatural occurrences continued, and with each one, her fear grew. The lights in the house began to flicker at random, plunging the rooms into darkness without warning. Objects would shift or fall over with no apparent cause, and strange, claw-like marks began appearing on the walls. John tried to explain them away as coincidences. Faulty wiring, the old house settling. But deep down, he knew that something far more sinister was at play. And then there were the dreams. John's nightmares became more frequent and more vivid. Every night, he found himself back in the woods, standing over the cat's grave, its ghostly form watching him from the shadows. The cat would approach him, its movements slow and deliberate, its eyes burning with anger. John could feel its hatred radiating off it, a palpable force that pressed down on him, suffocating him with guilt. He always woke up gasping for air, his body trembling, unable to shake the feeling that the cat was still with him, still watching. His mother wasn't sleeping any better. She would wake up in the middle of the night, swearing she heard the cat meowing or scratching at her door. Once, John found her in the middle of the night, standing in the hallway, staring at the front door as if she expected something to walk through it at any moment. "It's coming back," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "I know it is. It wants revenge." John was beginning to believe her. Chapter 6: Descent into Madness. As the days went on, the line between reality and nightmare began to blur. John's mother became more erratic. She started locking the doors and windows, covering them with heavy curtains as if to block out some unseen force. She refused to go outside, convinced that the cat, or whatever spirit it had left behind, was waiting for them. She would sit for hours by the fire, clutching the talismans she had bought, her lips moving in silent prayers. John, too, felt the walls closing in. The house, once his home, now felt like a prison, the air heavy with an unshakable sense of dread. The haunting grew worse. Now, even in the daytime, they could hear the faint meows echoing through the halls, the scratches on the walls growing deeper and more frantic. It was driving them both to the brink of madness. One morning, John woke up to find his mother standing in the kitchen, a knife clutched tightly in her hand. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot, her hair disheveled. She didn't seem to notice John standing in the doorway. "Mom!" John's voice was barely above a whisper. She turned to face him, but there was something different about her gaze. It wasn't the gaze of his mother. It was cold, distant, and empty. "It's here," she said, her voice hollow. "I can feel it. It's watching us, waiting for the right moment." John took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to do. His mother was unraveling right before his eyes, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. He had felt it too, the presence, the eyes in the dark, always watching, always waiting. Chapter 7: The Final Confrontation. The night it all came to a head was one that John would never forget. It was stormy, the wind howling outside, rattling the windows as rain lashed against the glass. John lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wide awake. His mother had barricaded herself in her room, refusing to come out. He couldn't blame her. The house no longer felt safe. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from downstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of something scratching at the door. John's heart leaped into his throat. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. Then he heard it, a low, haunting meow. John swallowed hard and got out of bed, his hands shaking as he made his way toward the stairs. Each step felt like an eternity. The house was dark, but he could hear the soft scratching, the cat's persistent meowing. He reached the bottom of the stairs, and that's when he saw it. Standing by the front door was the black cat. Its fur was wet and matted, its eyes glowing eerily in the dim light. But this time, there was something different about it, something unnatural. Its body seemed distorted, its limbs twisted at odd angles, and its eyes were filled with something far worse than anger. They were filled with vengeance. John's breath caught in his throat. He knew, without a doubt, that this was no ordinary cat. This was its spirit back for revenge, back to finish what it had started. The cat took a step forward, its eyes locked on John. He felt a wave of fear wash over him, his legs trembling as he backed away. "No, no, this isn't real," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're not real." But the cat kept coming. John stumbled backward, his heart racing. He had to do something. He had to stop it. And then, in a moment of pure desperation, he remembered the books. The old, dusty books his mother had bought from the village, filled with stories of spirits and curses. One of them had mentioned a ritual, a way to banish vengeful spirits. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance he had. Chapter 8: The Ritual. John's hands were shaking as he sprinted up the stairs, his breath ragged as he reached the attic. He yanked open the dusty door, and the smell of old wood and mildew hit him, but he didn't care. He needed those books. Somewhere in the pile of his mother's bizarre collection was the answer, the ritual that could save them. The sound of scratching and the low, eerie meow echoed through the house, following him up the stairs. John's heart pounded in his chest as he frantically rifled through the stacks of papers, searching for the old book that held the key to the ritual. Finally, he found it, an old, tattered book bound in cracked leather. His fingers fumbled as he flipped through the pages, scanning the strange symbols and cryptic text until he found what he was looking for. The ritual for expelling vengeful spirits. It wasn't a simple task. It required a sacrifice, an offering to appease the spirit, and an incantation to be spoken under moonlight. John's eyes widened as he read the instructions. He didn't know if he had all the materials, but he knew there wasn't much time. The scratching grew louder, closer, and the cat's meow, once soft and faint, was now a menacing growl. With trembling hands, John grabbed a piece of chalk and began drawing the intricate symbols on the floor, as instructed by the ritual. The shapes were strange and unfamiliar, spirals and symbols that seemed to twist and distort as he hurriedly sketched them out. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he muttered the incantation under his breath. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling against the windows as if the elements themselves were joining forces with the dark spirit inside his home. Thunder cracked, and lightning lit up the attic, casting eerie shadows on the walls. John reached into his pocket and pulled out the only thing he had that could serve as a sacrifice, a small pocket knife, one his father had given him long ago. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of it in his hand. Then, with a sharp breath, he cut his palm, letting the blood drip onto the chalk-drawn symbols. The moment the blood touched the floor, the house seemed to shudder. The air grew colder and the scratching stopped. For a moment, John allowed himself to hope that it was working. But then the cat appeared at the entrance to the attic. It stood there, its body twisted and broken, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Its mouth opened, and the meow that came out was no longer the sound of a cat. It was the sound of something ancient, something filled with rage. John backed away, clutching the knife in his bleeding hand. He had completed the symbols, spoken the words, and given his blood as the offering. He had done everything right, but the cat wasn't leaving. It advanced slowly, each step deliberate, its glowing eyes never leaving John's. As it stepped into the circle of symbols, the chalk lines flickered, as if the power of the ritual was struggling to contain the malevolent force. John began to chant the incantation again, his voice trembling with fear. His heart raced as the cat approached, its body now towering over him in the dim light of the attic. It was no longer just a cat. It was a manifestation of the dark force that had taken root in their lives. The cat's mouth opened wide, and a sound like a distorted scream filled the attic, shaking the walls and rattling the windows. The chalk symbols glowed briefly, and for a moment, the spirit hesitated. John's heart leaped with hope, but then the light faded. The cat lunged at John. In a panic, John slashed at it with the knife, but the blade passed through the cat as though it were made of smoke. He stumbled back, realizing too late that this was no ordinary spirit. This was something far more powerful, far more dangerous than he had imagined. The cat pounced, its claws slashing through the air, but instead of hitting John, they struck the symbols on the floor. The chalk lines shattered, breaking the circle that had been meant to contain the spirit. John screamed as the force of the cat's attack knocked him backward. He hit the floor hard, the breath knocked out of him. Pain shot through his chest, but he scrambled to his feet, trying to catch his breath. The cat was gone. For a moment, John thought it had disappeared, but then he felt it, a presence behind him. Slowly, he turned around, his heart in his throat. The cat was standing there, its eyes glowing with pure hatred. But something was different. It wasn't just the cat anymore. It was his father. Or rather, a twisted, nightmarish version of his father. The figure stood tall, its body misshapen and grotesque, its eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the cat's. It opened its mouth, and John heard his father's voice, distorted, broken, and filled with rage. "You shouldn't have killed it," the voice hissed, echoing through the attic. "You can't escape the curse." John's blood ran cold. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The cat wasn't just seeking revenge for its death. It was tied to something deeper, something from his family's past, something that his father had been a part of. Chapter 9: The Revelation. As John stood frozen, the figure of his father advanced, its twisted form moving with unnatural grace. John's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the curse, of why this was happening. The cat, the death, the strange occurrences, all of it tied to his father's past, something his mother had never told him about. "You brought this upon us?" The voice continued, growing louder, more accusing. The curse was always there. It was waiting. John backed away, his mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. His father had never spoken of curses, never hinted at anything supernatural. But the figure in front of him, the twisted version of his father, was telling him otherwise. Suddenly, memories flashed through John's mind. His father's odd behavior in the weeks before his death. The strange, whispered conversations his parents had late at night. It had all seemed so ordinary back then. But now, with the horror of the cat's vengeance upon him, it all took on a new, sinister meaning. His father had known. He had known about the curse. He had tried to protect them, but in the end, it hadn't been enough. The black cat spirit had come for them, and it wasn't going to stop until it had taken everything. John's eyes filled with tears as the figure of his father loomed over him, its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. Chapter 10: The Final Sacrifice. John stood motionless in the attic, the weight of his revelation pressing down on him like a leaden shroud. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to process what needed to be done. The curse was tied to the black cat, but the true source of its power lay in his mother's actions. She had killed the cat in a moment of desperation, and now it demanded a greater sacrifice to be satisfied. The figure of his father, or the twisted version of him, loomed closer, its glowing eyes filled with malice. "You know what must be done, John," the voice hissed, distorted and barely recognizable as his father's. "There's only one way to break the curse." John's heart raced as he backed away, his mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. How could he sacrifice his own mother? She had been broken by grief and fear, her mind unraveling as the curse had taken hold of their lives. But deep down, he knew the spirit was right. The curse was insatiable. It wouldn't stop until it had claimed what it was owed. Tears welled in John's eyes as he clutched the small pocket knife, still stained with his own blood from the failed ritual. He didn't want to believe what he was about to do. But as the storm outside raged, as the house groaned under the weight of the malevolent spirit, John realized there was no other way. With a heavy heart, he turned and descended the attic stairs, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The sound of his mother's voice echoed faintly from the living room below, where she sat by the fire, mumbling to herself, her hands clutching the protective talismans she had surrounded herself with. She was trying to fend off the evil that had taken root in their home, but John knew it was futile. No amount of prayers or charms could stop what was coming. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he paused, his hand trembling on the banister. The memories of his mother flashed through his mind. Her comforting smile when he was a child, the way she had always protected him, even after his father's death. But now, her fear had turned into something darker, something that had consumed her. She was no longer the mother he had known. John swallowed hard, wiping away the tears that blurred his vision. He walked into the living room, where the fire cast flickering shadows on the walls. His mother sat hunched in her chair, her eyes wide and bloodshot, muttering prayers under her breath. She didn't look up as John approached. "Mom," John whispered, his voice barely audible. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the fire. The shadows seemed to dance and twist around her, as if the very house was alive with the curse's dark energy. "Mom," he repeated, louder this time. Finally, she looked up at him, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes hollow. "It's here," she whispered. "I can feel it. The cat. It's coming for us." John's throat tightened. He stepped closer, the pocket knife clutched tightly in his hand, hidden from her view. "Mom, I can stop it. I can make it go away. But I need your help." Her gaze locked onto his, fear and confusion etched on her face. "What do you mean, John? What are you talking about?" John's heart pounded in his chest. He could barely breathe, the weight of what he was about to do crushing him. "The curse," he said softly. "It's because of the cat. You killed it, and now it wants something in return. I've tried everything, but there's only one way to stop it." Her eyes widened in horror, and for a moment, John thought she understood. No, it's not me. It's the cat. It's the curse," she cried, her voice rising in panic. John knelt beside her, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." Before she could react, John plunged the knife into her chest. Her scream filled the room, a sound of pure terror and betrayal. She gasped for breath, her hands clutching at the wound as blood poured from her body. John backed away, his own hands trembling violently, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, he whispered over and over, his voice breaking. His mother collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing as the life drained from her. Her wide eyes stared up at him, filled with shock and pain, and in her final moments, John saw a flicker of something else, recognition. As if, in her dying breath, she had finally understood the truth of the curse. John dropped the knife, collapsing to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. He had done it. He had made the ultimate sacrifice. His mother's life had been the price to end the curse, but the weight of that choice crushed him. He had killed the only family he had left. Chapter 11. The End of the Curse. The house grew eerily silent. The storm outside had calmed, the wind dying down to a gentle whisper. The oppressive presence that had haunted the house for weeks seemed to lift, as though the malevolent spirit had finally been appeased. John knelt by his mother's lifeless body, his mind numb with grief and disbelief. He had done what he thought was necessary. But now, in the stillness of the house, he felt hollow. Was it really over? Had the curse truly been broken? As he sat there, lost in his despair, he heard a faint sound. A soft, distant meow. His heart skipped a beat. Slowly, he looked up, his blood running cold. Standing in the doorway was the black cat. Its fur was sleek and pristine, no longer bloodied or twisted. Its eyes glowed softly in the dim light, and it stared at him with an expression that was almost peaceful. The cat walked toward him, its movements slow and deliberate. It circled his mother's body, its tail brushing lightly against the floor, before it sat down beside her, its eyes never leaving John's. And then it simply disappeared. John stared at the spot where the cat had been, his mind reeling. The curse was over. The black cat had finally been laid to rest. But at what cost? Epilogue: The aftermath. Weeks passed, and the house was quiet. The villagers whispered about John's disappearance, about how both he and his mother had simply vanished one night, leaving behind a home filled with strange markings and a lingering sense of dread. Some said it was the curse of the black cat that had taken them. Others believed something far darker had happened, but the truth was far more tragic. John, unable to live with the weight of what he had done, had left the village, disappearing into the surrounding forests, never to be seen again. His mother's body was never found, though some claimed to hear her voice on the wind, calling out for her son. The house stood empty, abandoned, its windows dark and lifeless. But on quiet nights, when the wind was still and the moon hung low in the sky, some claimed to hear a faint meow echoing through the halls. The curse was broken, but the memory of the black cat would linger forever. Thank you for joining us on tonight's journey into the unknown. If this story sent chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. For more terrifying tales, make sure to subscribe and check out our other videos on unexplained encounters. Remember, the next story could be even closer to home than you think. Stay safe, and until next time, keep your eyes open for the unexplained. Thank you for joining us on tonight's journey into the unknown. If this story sent chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. For more terrifying tales, make sure to subscribe and check out our other videos on unexplained encounters. Remember, the next story could be even closer to home than you think. Stay safe, and until next time, keep your eyes open for the unexplained.